Okay, take it away, Steve.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. Obviously this is another one of the many meetings on climate and energy plan, and very important process. Tonight, I think we're going to focus on something that we heard quite a bit about in some of the comments and people reacting to the plan, which is getting into the action plan details, getting into the real meat of how we're going to make some of these things happen, which I know a lot of people are anxious to get to. So that's good. We don't need to look at the bigger picture at this point. We really need to focus on how we can make things happen. I certainly appreciate everybody's feedback so far on the plan. The draft goals and strategies and action items. Now we're working on incorporating those into the document, all the comments that we received, and making those changes and adjustments to the plan. Also, I wanted to mention that the plan really is looking at the priority strategies for the next 5 years, the things that we can do to make a difference here in Watertown as it relates to the as we've already been discussing tonight, the ongoing climate challenges that we face. But an important part of that is that we'll revisit and make adjustments to the plan as we go forward, as we see what works and what doesn't work. In addition to what things change around us. Obviously, as I've already said, we're not going to be the solution to the world problems, but we can do our part. And I suspect that in the next 5 years there will be lots of things that change, that have dramatic impacts on us and that we have no control over. So again, I want to note that we will revisit things and make adjustments, and that's important to keep in mind. Also, certainly want to appreciate and thank everyone for participating in the group discussions. I know it's been a lot of work, and we appreciate everyone's help, and want to note that that's ongoing, continued conversation. We're going to need to have you all continue to participate, and really look forward to that. Also, I did want to note that one of the other things that we heard a good bit about is some concerns about the public opportunity to have conversation beyond these group conversations. And I think that the idea of the approach that we have is a good one, but also want to give some credence to that as well. And we'll be working on scheduling another public meeting, one for the general public, to provide some feedback to us. So stay tuned and look for more details for that coming in the near future. So with that, I will turn it back to KLA to take us through the evening's work.
Kim, I'll just, the festivities, why not? I will share my screen, and Kim, you can take it away.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Good evening. Kim Lundgren with KLA. Just wanted to echo Steve's comments and thank you all for participating in this process. I know we always want to try to get as much as possible in really what amounts to a short period of time when you think about planning, but you've all done a really great job of giving us a lot to work with, and us bringing you some of that data so that we can really come together and get the types of actions that are really going to move the needle and get you closer to your goals. I'm just going to give us a quick overview of what we're doing tonight. As Steve said, we're really diving in. We started up here, we've been working our way down, and now we're really, for lack of a better term, in the weeds, right? So much about having an actionable plan is about really understanding what are those individual steps and how will we move them forward and how long will it take. So really getting into looking at your actions, and we're going to talk tonight about how we can get them done. So that really when this plan is complete, these blueprints, you pretty much just rip it right out of the plan and hand them to the champions and say, go. so that things really keep moving, because we know that time is not something we have much of. It's probably our most precious and limited resource, right? So we've done our welcomes here, and Talia's going to walk us through kind of the plan process, remind you all kind of where we've been, what we've been doing, give you that update on the timeline, where everything's at. Then we're going to hear a bit from Laurel on the community engagement efforts that have happened to date. So folks can see how things have gone with the survey. I know a number of you participated in that, as well as some focus groups. Then we're going to move into more of that data-driven action development, really looking at some of those data components and how we're linking that to the actions that were identified. And then, as always, we like to really be hearing from you and working with you. And so we've got our breakout rooms for about an hour, most of this session, diving into those blueprints that I talked about, where we're really getting into those very specific steps of how we're going to get these things done. Our expectation is we'll get at least 2 done per plan element tonight. Some groups might get more, which is fantastic. And then there's now everyone will know how to do it and be able to kind of move the others forward. Then we're just going to wrap up, and as always, make sure we get you out on time. So really excited for everyone's active participation, and looking forward to diving in with this.
Thanks, Kim. All right. So I want to remind everybody that we are live streaming this. And so if you're watching on TV, you could send public comments or questions to resilient@watertown-ma.gov. All right, so our objectives today are to review our planning process and timeline, and talk about what we did in our last meeting and how that connects to what we'll be doing today. And then, as Kim said, we'll be breaking out into our different plan element working groups to develop implementation blueprints for select actions. And so we'll be talking through implementation steps and timeframes and partners, as well as some other planning considerations. And I want to emphasize here, as Kim said, that these 2 actions we'll be discussing today, you can add additional blueprints on other actions after this meeting. The purpose of this meeting is to really help you think through that process. And I know that Laurel is available to help different working groups build out blueprints for other actions. So as Kim mentioned, we started at a higher level with our vision and goals, and we had our first stakeholder advisory meeting in May. And we moved after that into action identification and refinement. So the working groups met independently to brainstorm on actions. And then we had our second stakeholder advisory group meeting in July. If you remember, we talked through those worksheets with different mechanisms and various sectors to kind of think through what specific actions could look like under different high impact strategies. And from there, we had some additional conversations with the working groups and with the town to build out a draft action list. And you all provided feedback on that in September. Thank you for that. And we're incorporating that feedback. And today, here we are at our 3rd stakeholder advisory group meeting. Of course, throughout all of this, we've been engaging with the broader community, and Laurel's going to speak to this a bit later on. So we've had surveys, renter and landlord focus groups and surveys, some in-person events, and various communications and outreach, as well as a chance to provide input on those draft materials. So the process does not end after today. We will be working on a draft climate and energy plan in the next couple of months. Steve mentioned there'll be a public input session at some point as well. And then we'll be releasing the draft plan for public feedback sort of late winter. And then beyond April, once we finalize the plan, it's really up to the community to be working on implementing it. In our last stakeholder advisory group meeting, we reviewed the results from the greenhouse gas baseline inventory. And as I mentioned, we brainstormed and refined actions using our worksheets with this screenshot here. As you remember, we thought through regulatory requirements versus educational initiatives versus incentives across different sectors. And we also talked through different barriers to implementation. You'll see some of those barriers and opportunities reflected in the blueprints today as well. So you'll be able to dive into some more conversation about that. All right, Laurel, it's your time to give a brief engagement update.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I know all of you know me because I email you constantly, but I'm Laurel. I'm the Senior Environmental Planner, sort of helping manage this process. Want to give you some updates on the engagement that we've been doing. Go to the next slide. So over the summer, we had our first general input survey that was live for a couple of months. That one was more focused on getting a sense of people's priorities and concerns when it came to climate threats, as well as mitigation and adaptation. We had 330 people fill that out, which is great. The key priorities that were identified were really more around energy efficiency and clean energy programs, public transportation improvements, and tree canopy protection. If you want to take a better, more in-depth look at all of the results of that, there's an engagement summary report available on the Resilient Watertown website. We also did some specific engagement with renters and landlords because almost half of Watertown residents rent their homes. So we designed 2 specific surveys for each of those groups. For the renters, we had 130 participants. Landlords, we only got 13. It's obviously a hard group to engage with, and knowing that is also sort of important moving forward because we can try to figure out better ways to engage with them. We also held focus groups with each of those populations. So for landlords, some of the key concerns that they voiced were around infrastructure and building damage, which makes sense. And then ensuring that there's support for owners and landlords of multifamily buildings. For renters, their key concerns were around the affordability of their energy bills, comfort during really hot and really cold days, and then actually walkability, sort of in terms of, you know, where they might choose to rent an apartment or a house. And recently, I staffed a outreach table at Fair on the Square. I saw many of you there. I had some really good conversations with everyone who was attending that event. I also staffed a table at the farmers market on 2 separate occasions during the farmers market season, which was also great to get out there and just talk to people and spread the word about the plan. We currently have our second general input survey live right now. Sorry if you can hear dogs barking. It is more focused around opportunities and barriers when it comes to implementing the plan. And that survey is currently open until November 17th. So please share that with your networks if you haven't already. There's also a link to it on the Resilient Watertown website. And as Steve mentioned, we are focusing on a public feedback and input and discussion session that will be happening probably in early December. So please keep your eyes out for information on that. And again, share that with your networks when we let you know the details.
Thanks, Laurel. I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk about our greenhouse gas analysis. And I realized I didn't introduce myself before. I'm Talia Fox. I'm with the KLA team that's supporting on this plan. And Mike, it's all you.
Thanks, Talia. And I'm Mike Steinhoff with the KLA team supporting this plan. Yeah, so just wanted to, again, give us a quick refresher on the sources and different ways that these actions are going to ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions, hopefully give us good food for thought in the exercises coming up. So Talia, next slide. Just a quick recap on what went into the greenhouse gas inventory. So this was starting with a base year of 2019. You know, the contributions from the different sectors there are, you know, pretty common for at least the makeup of a community in the Northeast. A few things that are worth noting. One, on the transportation side, this is both the local resident transportation as well as inbound commuters. We know that that's a big part of you know, having a lot of employer base there and thinking about those travel demands as well. I also want to point out that after some of our last engagements, we did get some feedback for looking at some additional sources, such as refrigerants. We have been doing a little bit of additional work on that to estimate them. They're not on the slide because there's still some refinement to do. I will say though that they're likely a larger source there in Watertown than what's visible for waste and wastewater. So it's something that we want to make sure that we recognize, and that we're also building in actions to address those. Next slide. We did also do some modifications to the business as usual projection. So this was something that we had an initial draft of in our last meeting. Changed some of the assumptions, a little more commercial development going on, and so you can kind of see that little bump here in the beginning years, but then those things start to ultimately get overwhelmed and fade out as greening the electricity grid happens. This is, we assume, is going to happen regardless of what goes on in Watertown, but obviously there's still quite a ways to go. Next slide. So then we've gone on to look at, okay, well, what would it be like to reach net zero at the latest by 2050? There's, of course, lots of things that could potentially play out over this long timeline to accelerate beyond that, but we want to make sure that that's at least the minimum that we're hitting. One of the key assumptions in this is that Watertown electricity choice is going to be a big component to this, and sort of continues going forward and requiring 35% more renewable energy than what the state is doing. So that's going to be continuing to push things forward on that side. Next slide. So the sort of inverse of this, and we'll look at these more individually in a moment, but so we were just seeing the emissions that remain. How do the different actions and the strategies that we're putting together contribute to this? So this is kind of the reverse side of the slide that I just showed previously. I did mention this before on what was going on with Watertown electricity choice. Basically, if we stay on that pathway, then we have effectively gotten to 100% clean electricity by 2036 if we're staying that much ahead of the state requirement. This doesn't show up in the charts that will follow, so I did want to call it out here what that sort of translates to. That individual yearly reduction does decline as the rest of the grid catches up, but it's not on the subsequent charts because it sort of sets the operating conditions where we calculate what is going to be happening with that action in place. So I did want to call this one out separately. Next slide. So on the buildings and energy side, you can see what the different strategies are there and how they're contributing. Obviously, existing buildings, it's the biggest source today. It's going to be the biggest source in 2050 and where we need to really focus a lot of our efforts. So those green areas will certainly be anything that is targeting the existing buildings is sort of what's modeled there. Versus the blue line, which is essentially avoided emissions from new construction. That said, this is a little bit of an artifact just of how we do the calculations. Certainly having net zero new construction and stronger building standards is going to contribute on the existing side and be the thing that helps those retrofits happen as people do major renovations. So it does kind of end up in both of those wedges. Next slide. And then also making sure that we're enhancing and actively promoting those deep retrofit programs is not just about electrification. That baked into these is also significant savings, reducing that amount of electricity that's going to be added to the demand side. That's going to make meeting those renewable energy goals that much more feasible. So something that is important to recognize here. Next slide. Keeping folks just informed of the level of effort that's going to be required to do these things. So I've had a version of this before, but it's always worth reiterating. There's a lot of residential properties to retrofit in order to realize those gains, especially in the green wedges that we saw there. So, we're talking about, in the 2030 time range, needing to be 570, 600 units per year of people switching these systems out. And the more that we do earlier, maybe the faster we can actually get to that 100% level in the out years. On the commercial side, obviously fewer interventions needed, but those can be certainly more in the planning and sort of feasibility to get them done. But that's essentially the schedule that the town will be needing to hit to stay on these pathways. Next slide. Switching over to transportation and mobility, the big thing here obviously is the shift to electric vehicles. That's where really a lot of the reductions are going to come from, particularly the two green wedges that we have there. What's basically the proportion from resident EVs versus the inbound commuters. It's roughly half and half. Also, the blue line there represents the local commercial fleets. That's also something that is going to need to be electrified as well. Next slide. And then in addition to EVs, of course, anything that we can do to avoid transportation demand in general is just going to make that transition that much easier. So those actions that we take to enhance zero carbon mobility, active transportation, all of those sorts of things is actually a pretty big contributor to reducing this section as well. Next slide. Some quick assumptions in the transportation and mobility side. So, essentially, looking at the schedule of how quickly do we need to do these retrofits. Some of this is based on the minimums that we need to be hitting in the near term and the 2030 timeline, but also getting to that 2050 timeline of being 100% retrofitted. This does include some assumptions about what's going to happen on the manufacturing side of things, particularly for the medium and heavy duty trucks. There are some initiatives out there that say there will be no more of these by 2040. So that's sort of the thing that we've baked in to this as the thing that we're hoping to have happen, but then we'll need to accelerate beyond that and get, within 10 years, essentially those last combustion vehicles to cycle out. On the active and zero carbon mobility, just noting that there's so many great actions in the bike ped plan and other plans that have been going on. It can be fairly difficult to model those behavior change actions specifically, but in aggregate, we think that you could get to basically achieving sort of the Cambridge-like rates of car ownership and driving, and that would result in about 8,000 households giving up their cars and choosing something else. And those reduction in 8,000 households in those vehicles are reflected in slightly fewer EVs that we got to switch in. Next slide. And I believe this is the last one, of course, those waste management strategies. That's kind of the again, the smallest piece of the wedge there. But, really anything related to waste and consumption has much bigger impacts beyond Watertown. But of course, we want to be focusing these strategies, particularly around the parts of our consumption of waste stream that generate emissions here in Massachusetts with our pathway to incineration for most of our management. Getting those plastics and the fossil component of our waste stream out is going to be key. So that was a lot of information. We do have a little bit of time here for answering any quick Q&A, but of course we can always follow up offline if there's something that folks want to dig into a little deeper.
Feel free to put things in the chat during the presentation as well as things come up. And you can use the raise hand function if you'd like, or I see that Pat I see that you're raising your hand as well physically. So if you wanted to unmute and ask your question, that would be great.
My question is just, it goes back to the transportation, and I'm just unclear about how the T, buses and trains, fits into this.
Yeah, that's a great question, Pat. So they are in the inventory. So what we how we incorporated those was we could look at onboarding and passengers getting off within Watertown on the various bus lines that serve the community, and then essentially with what we assumed from there is that folks who are getting on the system within Watertown then have sort of the general average rider sort of characteristic, and maybe they take it further into town and transfer to the subway system or some of the other components. And basically we gave those miles that you're traveling on the system a system average emissions intensity. So it sort of averaged out if you're riding a bus, if you're riding the electric trolleys, if you're riding the subway side, and sort of blended those together, and then basically use that rate to say how much they were contributing to the overall system. So part of what we also assume that happens here in terms of those emissions going away is that the system itself, which is largely electric, and hopefully all of the bus fleets and the things that are not directly connected also convert to electric over time, and that those end up being powered by clean electricity. And so they sort of fade away almost naturally because of the things that are going on beyond Watertown itself. But those VMT reductions from mobility options, they're in the red wedge. Part of that would be people again leaving their cars behind and taking one of those other very low or zero carbon options.
Thanks. We do have a couple other questions in the chat. We had one from William Clark asking, these are forecasts, how are we going to achieve it? And what part of this is dependent on actions taken by the Watertown government and residents versus state and national actions? And what are the key assumptions about what we should do in Watertown to achieve these?
Well, that's really what the next steps are all about, right? What's sort of forecasting here. I mean, the business as usual, which was the much earlier slide that only I think, well, we basically the thing that was in there that was assuming that the state requirements for electricity ultimately got to carbon-free electricity, but that was the only thing that was sort of baked in from a higher level of government. At this point, all of the things that need to happen to have those results play out are actions that will need to be taken locally, whether it's something that the town government is doing or people acting on their own in the spirit of these things to do what they're doing to electrify their homes, change their behavior practices, and so on. That said, I think maybe some of the rates that we hope to see, those ambitious targets for how many electrifications we need to have and how many of those vehicles need to be replaced, would be certainly have some headwinds behind them if the state and national governments start making good on their commitments to do these things, because it certainly will take some support. And I think the goals of this plan is to make sure that Watertown is ready to hit the ground running as more of those resources become available, and you can take advantage of them.
Thanks. I think we'll move on with the presentation, but I just want to mention that there are a couple questions in here asking about specific actions, like Susan's question about electric fans, as well as Libby's question about getting plastics out. I think those are great conversations for breakout groups, and I encourage everybody to review the list of actions that I believe Laurel sent around to provide any additional feedback on that. Okay. Thanks everyone for your feedback. So all of the actions and strategies that Mike was just talking about are really focusing on climate mitigation, so reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But it's also important that this plan is about adjusting to impacts of climate change that are ongoing and are going to continue to worsen. So we know that there will be more extreme precipitation and temperature and shifting patterns. And those are going to lead to climate hazards, including intense storms and flooding and drought and heat waves. And this creates a whole host of impacts for the community on community health and well-being, damage to critical facilities and infrastructure, as well as stress on natural resources and wildlife. So we keep this in mind as a motivation to develop strategies on resilience in many of the plan elements. So in infrastructure in particular, a key strategy is integrating climate change projections into the design and upgrade of all new infrastructure. And so actions under this strategy are going to include design guidelines for resilience and maintenance for infrastructure and backup power options, among other actions. In the case of natural resources, we know that, oh, sorry, getting an echo there. All right, thanks. We know that natural resources provide both mitigation and adaptation benefits. So this is a screenshot of a analysis that Mike did to assume that we plant additional trees in Watertown on some available impervious surfaces, as well as open space without structures in the way. And so making those assumptions, we have a potential to increase canopy cover by about 10% in Watertown, which would add around 48 acres of tree cover and have the potential to sequester 6,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And I'm sure Mike can speak to more of those assumptions if you are curious. So given that natural resources and trees in particular have these mitigation as well as adaptation benefits, key strategies in this plan element include regenerative landscaping and maintenance, and minimizing the quantity and improving the quality of stormwater runoff. So this is going to include actions like planting more trees, biodiversity improvements, equitable distribution of trees, especially in areas at high risk of urban heat impacts. Beyond trees and natural resources, we have strategies to promote regenerative landscaping and maintenance, as well as to minimize the quantity and improve quality of stormwater runoff. So that's going to include, oh, sorry about that. I think I repeated the strategies from the previous slide. So the regenerative landscape strategies are going to include things like green infrastructure and stormwater and education on both of these topics. I'll just go back a slide. I think I didn't read the tree slides strategies. So the strategies for trees are going to be enhancing forest and open space parcels and protecting and enhancing and diversifying the tree canopy. Sorry about that. Multiple screens. Under public health and community preparedness, we're really addressing climate resilience. So we want to promote climate literacy and education, as well as provide resources to enhance community health and well-being. And then we want to provide equitable access to emergency preparedness and response resources and ensure community connectivity. And that's really responding to climate impacts to ensure health and well-being of the community. I want to emphasize a few cross-cutting strategies. So we know that there's a lot of intersections across these different plan elements. So a few cross-cutting strategies that will be in the plan are going to be around an outreach and education campaign to promote the plan, assistance for renters and landlords on things like energy efficiency and EV charging, we know that there are a lot of entities and municipalities in the region that are collaborating, and we want to be part of those collaborations because everybody is going to be working toward the same goals and targets. And then finally, and we heard this loud and clear in your feedback on the actions, thank you very much. We know that this is not going to get done without additional capacity on the part of the town. So a cross-cutting strategy will be adding capacity and resources to various town divisions and offices. Okay, I will pause briefly again for some questions here. I see there's a bunch in the chat, so just give me a second to scan through those. Let's see. So let's see, it looks like Mike actually answered William's question, and the slides will be available after this. I will reiterate actually the question and answer that Mike and that William put in the chat, just in case folks are not reading this. So William Clark asked, is the 10% tree cover for town owned and administered land, or what private land owners could do? And the response to that, Mike had said, well, Mike, you can take it away.
I can probably say it better than I did in a quick chat. You know, essentially we wanted to just see what that potential would look like, and I did making some assumptions, but we wanted to say, okay, well, where is there available land? So looking at, you know, the impervious surfaces that aren't encumbered by a structure, and you know, we could see how those are classified, whether it was you know, basically a parking lot versus you know, some other use that wouldn't necessarily be conducive to having a tree on it, and you know, basically thought, okay, what's some reasonable things to say we could improve or capture some percentage of that available land. So, you know, again, sort of assumptions and guesses that, you know, 10% of the impervious surface around residential structures we think could have tree cover on them. You know, and of course, a tree is going to provide much more area than you know, just in terms of the cover. Not like it has to take up all that space because the canopy overhangs. 25% of the sort of impervious surface around commercial buildings seem like a reasonable thing to go with, and then half, maybe 50% of the available, you know, existing open space would get a tree on it. So, you know, basically that being stuff that is already being used as open space and could be sort of filled in around the edges. So, you know, again, those were pretty broad assumptions, but the idea was just to illustrate, well, if you did those kinds of things, how much tree cover could we achieve with that? Ended up being roughly 10%, and what does that translate to in the sequestration benefit? So obviously those numbers could change, but I think it's illustrative of the opportunity that's there.
Thanks, Mike. And I also wanted to respond to a comment that there was a concern that some of the strategies, or that the strategies did not translate into specific things that specific people are doing. And that is why we have the action level under all of the strategies, which gets a little bit more specific. And again, I encourage you to take a look at the action lists that Laurel sent around. And then even further, we're going to be digging into more details about what specific groups and what specific people would be responsible for doing components of these actions. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. I don't think we have any more questions in the chat, so it's about time that we move into breakout groups, and I think we can keep going. Mike, did you have another comment?
No.
Okay, great. Okay. So these are the implementation blueprints that we'll be working on in our breakout groups today. So we'll be talking through the action description and the champion who is going to be leading the action, as well as the overall timeframe. And then we'll talk through the implementation steps and their timeframes, as well as key partners. And we'll talk through some equity considerations, as well as financial tools and resources, as well as opportunities to overcome implementation barriers. So that's just a rough overview of what we're covering. Your facilitators are going to help guide you through this process, and we will be splitting up into our working group breakouts just as soon as our tech support, Danielle, is ready for us, and then we'll get going. And I want to mention that buildings and development will be staying in the main room, so you will be staying put if you're in that group.
Talia, I just wanted to reiterate that while tonight, we're focusing on getting through a couple of these blueprints, moving forward, we can and will absolutely create more blueprints for more actions. It's just for the interest of time tonight and our consultants' time, we're focusing on a couple. If your favorite action is not covered tonight, that does not mean that we're not going to do an implementation blueprint for it. That's something that your working groups will be working on in the coming months. So I just wanted to make that crystal clear.
Thanks, Laurel. Okay, Danielle, how are we doing?
We're doing fabulous, Talia. I'm ready.
Great.
All right. Good evening, everyone. For those of you who maybe haven't participated in a Zoom breakout before, we're just going to get started here. You'll see a quick flash and it will push you into your breakout room accordingly. And you're going to get a couple little messages from me throughout this journey to let you know when we're about halfway through, and then when we have about 5 minutes left. And then at the end, you'll get, when we do close the rooms, 1 minute to wrap up and come back to the main room. So without further ado, I'm going to open up the rooms and enjoy.
Thanks, Danielle.
Okay, Burlington Energy Group. We have stayed here in the main room. So just a word of warning to y'all, we are still continuing to be broadcast. So we are live. We are also continuing to record the session. I'm going to record it individually. I think it may also be just as a backup, of course, to capture this discussion here. Of course, all the recordings from all the sessions are going to be made publicly available. So you got stuck in this group with us, but if there's other parts of this conversation that you're interested in, you'll be able to go back and review those recordings on your own. Just a quick couple things in terms of logistics. Of course, it's great for folks to keep your video on as you're participating here. We love to see people's faces. It can definitely help have the dialogue be a little more personal. But of course, if you need to take the video off for whatever reason, take a little break, please, by all means, feel free to do so. We also, just in terms of ground rules, I think as hopefully a much more sort of focused implementation conversation, it'll be pretty productive here, but please be mindful of your other participants here. We want to assume that everyone is coming with their best intentions, and take whatever maybe comes out of someone's mouth with that assumption in mind, that we're all trying to contribute to the crafting these actions in a way that is going to be feasible for everybody that's involved. So take those into consideration as we deliberate. Definitely, we know that there's also a lot of expertise in the room, which is great, but we also want to make sure that if there's folks who haven't had a chance to chime in, myself and Andrew will help to try to make space for those, making sure that everybody has a chance to be heard here. We are going to go through, filling out this rather specific task here of creating implementation blueprints. This is something that KLA does in a lot of our plans, so we don't just have a list of actions, but we've got something with some concrete next steps for them. As I think Talia and Laurel both mentioned, there will absolutely be an opportunity to create more of these blueprints. We're going to focus on trying to do 2 of them here tonight, but if there's more actions that we want to try to go through this level of detail with, the working groups are free to be able to lead those conversations. And if there's folks here that aren't part of a working group, then maybe you can we can connect you to the right people to participate in those conversations. So just making sure I'm not forgetting any key pieces of our logistics here. Okay, I think we're good on that. So it's a pretty small group here, but I see a lot of familiar faces, but it's always helpful to do some introductions, especially as we're being broadcast, so that folks who maybe are tuning in can get a sense of who's sort of in the room here. So again, I'm Mike Steinhoff with Kim Lundgren Associates, and I'm going to call on people just so that we don't have to stumble over each other, and let Andrew go.
Hello all, my name is Andrew Pettit. I'm the Greenhouse Gas Analysis Manager with KLA, and I'm here today to just record all the questions and concerns and notes that we have during the workout group. Thank you.
And I'll go with Ed next.
Good evening. I'm Ed Lewis. I am the town's energy manager, and really happy to be working with this. The climate action plan has been moving along, and very enthusiastic to dive down to the real action steps that we're working on tonight.
Ed?
Sorry, did you say Brian?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Brian Haybison. I'm a member of Watertown Environment Energy Efficiency Committee. I'm also a member of Watertown Faces Climate Change, and I am the chair of the Building and Energy Working Group for the Climate Action Plan.
Thanks, Brian. Brian's been a great resource also in engaging in this on a regular basis. So thanks for that, Brian. William.
Bill Clark, I'm a teacher.
Great, thanks, Bill. Pat.
Pat Rathbone. I'm with WFCC and WEC3, and most interested in climate equity.
Excellent. Thank you, Pat, and thank you for representing that. Susan. Susan, you're muted. Susan, we can't hear you. Looks like you're still on mute. Okay. Sorry, Susan, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Muted. Okay. Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm with WFCC, and I work with commercial developers to advocate for climate-friendly technologies in buildings, energy efficiency, and also climate-friendly materials. And our goal is net zero buildings, obviously, on new construction.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And then I'm guessing the two Marcuses I see are the same Marcus. So.
That's correct. I'll throw my camera on. Marcus DeCastro. I actually work for Boylston Properties, stakeholder in Watertown. I spend the majority of my time out here. It's kind of a decent, great segue to follow Susan, because we're a commercial real estate developer as well. And I'm excited to be here and be a part of the dialogue. Just however we can, what we can do to contribute to the dialogue as well. I think it's an interesting topic, and I think it's something we definitely need to be involved in.
Great, thank you, Marcus. And I also will take a moment just to recognize, with this group in particular, there's been lots of comments that have come in both from WFCC, Boylston properties in the earlier parts of the planning process, and those were really great. It was great to see folks taking it seriously to make those comments, and they're things that we've been working in to the action language to date for all the actions that are being considered. But of course, we're going to focus in on just two of them for today, which I believe were selected by the Buildings and Energy Working Group are the ones that we wanted to focus on, which are, well, time for me to start sharing my screen. And moving some things around. So maybe just a brief review of the things that are in there. So there's a lot of individual actions from the various ways of promoting electrification, looking at embodied carbon through maybe whole building LCA and some other things that could be worked into maybe parts of the actions that we're going to talk about here today. A lot of the stuff, you know, particularly on buildings and energy, it's all interrelated. I think that's one thing that we'll have to keep in mind as well as we go through these in more detail, that some of these, you know, there are some specific actions targeting a few of the maybe concepts that we're going to run into today. But yeah, I think it's just good to keep that in mind as we go through all of these. And of course, you know, behind the scenes, making sure that we're accelerating through lots of different mechanisms, some of them, again, related to this for doing on-site renewables. Of course, I'll be part of it, but ultimately getting to that 100%.
Mike, would you mind just zooming in real quickly?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And people, please feel free to prompt me if you can't read something or hear something. Yeah, definitely feel free to jump in and remind me of those sorts of things. Okay, so we have our two actions, which are a building energy use disclosure ordinance, as well as moving to net zero building standard. And you know, I was thinking about, well, is there maybe a sensible way to go through these? And you know, one of the things, just looking at the other communities around here in the area that have been going through this process, really the energy use disclosure ordinance seems like it has a lot of mechanisms within it that are sort of the building blocks that maybe we would want to consider for doing a net zero performance standard. So I thought that we would start with that one and bring this over. And we can start going through the process here. So, you know, again, just to reiterate where what we're doing here is to sort of fill this out. We're going to identify the steps, who is responsible for doing these sorts of things, barriers to implementation, and again, really give sort of that instruction guide of like, okay, well, where is the town going to have to go from here as soon as the plan wraps up. So before we actually go through and start filling this thing out, maybe I'll just pause there for a second to see if anyone has any questions or anything else that you want to contribute before we dive into blueprint development.
I have a question. I guess my question would be that in the way this is worded right now is that the ordinance would be to track and report usage with the eventual goal to have reduction targets over time. And the way this is worded, it's unclear to me whether there would actually be reduction targets included in the initial action. And I ask that because so it says in an ordinance, because, for instance, Boston has an ordinance currently on the books that already includes targets for reduction. And I was wondering, again, why we would wait to actually include that as part of the ordinance.
That's a
I
great.
didn't state that very well. I'm sorry.
No, I definitely get the point of the question, Brian. So, and this is obviously not final language or the particulars of it. I think it just meant to sort of capture the spirit of what we're trying to achieve here. And I think certainly the initial ordinance very well could have that first set of reduction targets, or that schedule that I know that Boston has laid out in terms of where they want to see those benchmarks be over time. So I think part of the maybe what we want to do here is, as thinking about those implementation steps, one of the steps that we should probably describe is the process for setting what those targets should be and how do we arrive at that. So hopefully that answers the question. And again, I think yes, those targets could be in the initial ordinance, and then of course, I would imagine, as everything will be over the next 20, 30 years, revisited and hopefully with some adaptive management principles in mind, that we're always looking for the place that we can accelerate going forward. Okay. Anything else maybe that folks want to add just about the action itself or its intent? Okay. Hearing none, let's go ahead and start filling this out. And the first question that we want to have well established is really who is going to be the champion, who's going to be the functional part of the town government, or maybe associated partners, community committees, other folks that are really going to have to be the ones that will be the point of contact for driving this thing forward. I'm gonna open this up for anybody to chime in. I'm thinking it probably has some immediate thoughts on that. And looks like you're ready to go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, typically the ordinances are driven through the community development and planning group, working in conjunction with the building committee folks and that, because there is a very set methodology that needs to be done to get an ordinance drafted and set up and run. Ultimately, it has to go through town council to be approved.
Is that something beyond getting the sort of wheels of government turning to make it happen, and the processes that they would go through? They would also need the folks that would end up maybe periodically reviewing it, or being the bodies that would say review submissions under the reporting requirements, and deem them either in compliance or not. And I guess maybe that's a question that this may be a new function that hasn't been considered before, of who would actually be thinking about compliance and making sure that the reporting is actually being administered. Pat, I see your hand, but you're muted.
I'm confused because it seems like the actual ordinance would happen very quickly, that would be a date that would be, say, 2023 or something, 2022. And Brian brought up the thing about targets, and I'm wondering if in this initial action, there shouldn't be the first targets, say the 2025 targets, with a notation that the later targets would be developed later. I know I'm confused.
Yeah, that's a good point, Pat. I think, yeah, I think just as you said, that, you know, maybe some initial set of targets would be set as part of this process, and then further targets developed, you know, as it's revisited over time. So yeah, I think that's.
But the Budo ordinance can happen very quickly, right?
Correct.
The initial, yeah.
Yes.
Can we put a date on that?
That is where we will get to. So
okay, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So we've got the overall time frame. We're going to go back and revisit this at the end once we've gone through all the steps and think about what is it all going to take to bring this together. So maybe we can just dive in on the implementation steps on this one. So you know, just some prompting questions. I mean, I think Ed started us off with some good food for thought in terms of the committees and the processes that they would be needing to go through. Those are obviously some early steps that would need to happen to kick things off. But you know, I'm sure there's additional studies, engagement, those sorts of things that will need to either gather more information, you know, clear various sorts of administrative hurdles, those sorts of things. So what we want to do here is identify all of those sorts of things that are going to be the processes that we want to go through. And you know, as we fill this out, maybe we don't have to worry so much about the sequence of these things. We can, of course, we'll be refining these what we come out of this meeting with, and some things we may end up reordering after more consideration. But you know, we really want to just get the main steps out there in the open. So as we identify those, we're looking at the time frame, and just for keeping it in mind that the time frame in this instance is meant to be, you know, how long does it take to complete this step, whether it's you know, it could be a 6-month study, for example, or you know, if it's a step that is a review process, how long is that review process? And then we'll take those and sort of build those together to figure out, like, okay, what is that end date, Pat, that you were asking about? When do we actually get to the point of implementing it? And of course, as we go along, any key partners who are the folks we're going to need to engage with, making sure that we're identifying those. Okay, so I'm going to take a break and open it up, folks, for thoughts, suggestions on first implementation steps that we should take here.
So I would say, I think your point about a review would be a good first step, right? So, and I think part of that would be reviewing existing ordinances for, you know, so we don't reinvent the wheel. You know, Boston is an obvious one, but I'm sure there are other examples out there.
And that's actually something that probably is a fairly short time frame, you know, that I would imagine could be, you know, specifics of this plan that we're doing right now, but let's just call it a month. And the key partners who we believe would be leading that forward. Do you think that's the committees, the sort of official building committees? Is that other parts of the, is it WEC3? Any and all, I mean, it would be more than just one.
Yeah, Mike, I think I sort of see this a bit as like when the solar requirements ordinance was drafted. That was sort of a 3-year cycle time, but I believe it will follow the same sort of process. And reviewing the existing ordinances that had been done for the solar ordinance, we certainly had a champion in town who was championing that. But after that was brought forward and it was brought to the town council, the town council had assigned the community development planning group to draft the ordinance, check what was out there, draft the ordinance. After the drafting, it went to the planning board, and the planning board went and took 2 separate meetings on it, both with open public process, public input. I'm not sure we're to the planning board on this one yet, because they need to have something. They wouldn't physically be drafting it. They would be, I think, working on the draft that was presented to them. Typically, it is community development and planning with input from others, such as WE3C, WFCC, would draft up the initial ordinance. That typically would go to the actual planning board, since this would be considered a building. My expectation is that would go to the actual planning board, since this would be considered a building ordinance. And they would have to have a couple of meetings on that, spaced out at different intervals with public input. And then they typically decide whether the ordinance goes forward to the town council and what their recommendation is, whether to pass it, whether to go from there. Then town council would typically have a couple of meetings on that, with 2 public meetings with public input on it, typically before they would vote. So settle on that one, but I think you have the first pass, where we don't, as Brian said, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. A lot of other smart folks have done a lot of good work on stuff like this. So we should use the best available. Second step, I would suggest it probably goes to the planning board from there, and they have a set process. They have to do that with public meetings.
Okay. I think maybe that is actually after the ordinance language is developed. I wonder if we, as I was thinking about some of these things as well, ones that maybe even get ahead of that, I think reviewing the existing ordinances for guidance is good. I think setting some of the reporting thresholds and maybe thinking a little bit more in depth about the types and size thresholds of buildings would be an important step. I don't know, part of that could be adopting the same thresholds as, say, the solar ordinance, but I do think that there's probably some additional research to happen within the town to just make sure that we're hitting that right target group.
Yeah, for the solar ordinance, we followed some of the state building code, which just come out with a solar zoning requirement. So that one was, fell in line with that. I remember reading the Boston ordinance a while ago, and it did have some size and shapes and all, some structure on what buildings required it, but it was pretty tight.
Right. But is there a step to thinking about where those existing thresholds are on those other ones, and thinking, okay, does that map well to the built environment in Watertown?
But yeah, I was thinking that one thing was just the analysis that was done on the square footage of the largest buildings, that even just the, the 50,000 foot level stuff that is in the climate action plan material that we have, right, where you broke down the square footage sizes of the larger buildings. And I think that shows some natural breaking points for that. And we could map that against sort of what Boston used and see if it's similar to what they used, and if not, tailor it to what makes sense for Watertown. But it seems to be a detail that we don't need to figure out here, but I think you're right that we need to do that step.
Okay, so maybe that's actually in this first
Yeah,
step.
I think it would be included in one, really.
Yeah.
Like actually sort of review our own ordinance, like our solar ordinance as a best practice as well. And also look at our data for our our commercial stock.
Great, we can continue to flesh that out. That probably extends that that sort of internal research. Maybe you could call it a 2-month process, but I think that could take a little bit of time. Okay, so we've got these sorts of getting the ordinance language. Other things that I want to think about, whether they have where's the right place to put these things in. Thinking about the actual mechanism for doing the reporting. Obviously, I think everybody sort of defaults to EPA portfolio manager as a good available resource to do this for folks to put their data in and get it to a centralized place. Do we need to think about some capacity building that happens somewhere, both maybe within the town to be on the sort of receiving end, as well as with the targeted buildings, and where should that come? Is that something that we should be putting ahead of getting the ordinance in place, or making sure that we're thinking about that in the process? Okay. Maybe that comes later after the ordinance.
Mike, Mike, you're saying that would be a mechanism to satisfy the ordinance by using the EPA tools.
Right.
I missed a little piece of that. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I think I just wanted to make sure we're considering how is it that the ordinance would, we would certainly be wanting to, I think, specify within it the mechanisms by which people would be using to do the reporting, to do their own building EOI calculations, those sorts of things. And is that something that is going to require some capacity building internally to sort of prepare for in advance of crafting the ordinance language around something that we know that we'll be able to utilize? My sense is that that's probably a good overall strategy to take, but open to thoughts.
Please recognize Susan. She's had her hand up forever.
Susan, yeah.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
I'm just wondering if, as part of the implementation process, we shouldn't incorporate what happens to this data. What are we going to do with it? Who gets it? Just to be sure that this report isn't an exercise that's done in vain.
Yep. So
So who collects these reports and what happens to the information? What are we going to actually do with it? I mean, so like Ed's going to do something with it, and does he need resources to do that, or development and planning, or what?
yeah, no, Susan, it's a great point, and sort of what I was getting at in terms of the mechanism by which we collect.
Yeah, you referred to it, absolutely.
Yeah. So what does that look like? And maybe not to put you on the spot, but what do you think you would need to be incorporating this? And then, you know, I think where my mind goes in terms of what do we do with it, in that you know, it probably means annual reporting out both to council, to all the climate related processes that are going on in town, to look at where this can inform you know, further refinement of activities going on in Watertown to ultimately continue to bring these numbers down.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely a great point. And just to reference back to the solar ordinance, for new buildings, it's I don't want to say easy, but for new buildings that go through site review with the town, they're required to provide a solar evaluation done by a solar company that has looked at the property and has laid out a tentative solar array and provide production numbers. So that is part of the site review, so that they do have to provide that. That has to be deemed acceptable. That is done by the community development planning, and myself go through those for each of the new buildings and determine, you know, was it a reasonable site assessment for that building. And that's a requirement to have that, to have a reasonable assessment that both solar wise and financial wise before they can get the building permit. This one is a little tougher in that as we go forward with existing buildings, we don't currently have anything that I can think of that's a real good reference to existing buildings, where each year they have to report their energy utilization index. And I am a fan of, pardon me, I am a fan of having goals on this, you know, right from the get-go. I know that was mentioned up front, so that we can at least see on a year-over-year basis. And the vision would be that would be submitted to that'd be community development planning, because the enforcement arm is typically zoning after, you know, after a building is built. But that gets into the whole question of, okay, if they don't hit their goals, which I am a fan of having, what do we do? And this needs a lot of thought and some review. Do they get penalized in some way? You know, is it, there should be some, we're gonna be asking these folks to collect a lot of data, and I agree with that, but we do need to have a plan to put it to good use, and would love to have some either incentives for hitting their goals, or, you know, penalties for not hitting a goal.
Yeah. Establishing incentives. Yes, Bill.
Well, just amen to both Ed's and Susan's comments. Looking across other things I do in the energy sustainability space, we are imposing an immense burden of reporting requirements on everybody and their dog. And I would like one of our implementation steps to be, once we've done generating our contribution to that dog pile of things that just irritate people, build up long-term resistance to doing the important stuff, is which of these things are really the most important to get done, I don't see any possible goal for reducing energy use per se, unless I link it to where the energy is coming from. I put some comments up on that in the text. If somebody's energy use goes up because they're providing EV stations in their building, this is probably a good thing, especially if they're plugging the EV into a renewable net. We don't want, I have no understanding of why we would want to minimize emissions. I get the solar one. We want to radically increase solar. I get an emissions requirement because we want to get the damn emissions down. But why are we focusing on an energy requirement divorced from where that energy is coming from? We're just going to tick people off without any actual thing we would rationally do with the results.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point, Bill. And I wonder if, you know, does this actually start getting us to the segue of looking at more of a net zero carbon action, where this is but one component to that larger goal of putting things in that better context. And this is one of the many strategies that we hope building owners are participating in to, you know, have that sort of portfolio approach on bringing things together. So I will maybe just sort of keep these things sort of moving along. Do we want to say more about, you know, potentially what the time frame on these individual steps would take, or is there something missing? You know, key details that we think we're missing at this point, you know, not recognizing that these are fairly high level. Okay, well, I'm going to keep moving us along then. There are some additional things that we want to make sure that we're thinking about in the context of putting these things together, and just give us a quick moment to think about equity considerations. You know, this one is maybe less equity focused than some of the other actions that are being considered in the plan, but yeah, let's open it up here for thoughts on maybe what kinds of resources might be required, to Bill's point, for not overburdening folks with this.
Well, I think that the most fundamental equity consideration is that we're talking about using this, having limits on the size of the buildings that this is going to be applied to. And so I think by definition, it's going to be, you know, some built-in equity considerations because of that. I think that's going to be the major way to make sure that it's equitable.
Is there more to that, Brian, just in terms of saying, okay, is there that the consideration for the threshold is both how much of the building space is considered, as well as the capabilities of likely building owners of a certain size?
I mean, I just think the demographics of it, right? If we're talking about equity, these are not low-income households. They're not, you know, that the demographic that we're concerned about. I think with equity, they're large commercial enterprises. So I think by definition, that's not a stakeholder we're concerned about from an equity standpoint.
Yep, you're good. Pat?
Well, I think we had a 10,000 square foot threshold because, in fact, we were concerned about not having a lot of impact on, say, your typical two-family residential property. So if this is only applying to commercial properties, is it? Then I agree with Brian. But if it's going to be a BUTA that applies to residential as well, then I do think we need to think about probably not just size, but some other issues before we say a property falls under this ordinance. Is it just commercial?
I would assume it would be multifamily residential as well.
Right. I guess when I said commercial, if it's multifamily residential, by definition, that's a commercial enterprise, right? I mean, I guess you could consider condos in that circumstance. So maybe not in all circumstances. I'm not an expert in this, but in most circumstances, I think it's going to be some kind of a commercial entity that's going to be doing the reporting.
Right. I think it mostly boils down to how many meters are there. If it's a single owner and who pays the meters on behalf of everyone.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could specifically call that out and say, you know, look at equity specifically in the thresholds.
Okay.
Well, what does that mean? Equity in energy use?
Not equity in energy use, equity in terms of how the, I mean, I think it gets to what you're talking about before, Bill, in terms of how the ordinance itself maybe puts particular burdens on folks that could be ameliorated if we're thoughtful about it. Okay, well, just in the interest of keeping us moving, financial resources. Obviously, Ed, I think this is going to put some needs on your side for capacity and running these things. Do we have ways identified that the town would actually be able to staff up and make sure that this is something we can continue to do?
The town would not be performing these analyses, right? This is something for the individual building owners to do.
Correct. So there is that part of it, and maybe some financial considerations for the sort of regulated entities, but the town will have to do something with that, with the information, right? And sort of have the processes around, and maybe they just sort of roll into the existing planning processes, and it's not, there isn't an additional financial need there, but we want to make sure that we're thinking about it.
Yeah, I don't see an additional requirement on the town side, but this is this does have an impact to the individual building owners.
Yeah.
Well, there's the resources to roll up this data, right? I mean, are we well staffed for that?
I'm sorry, Susan, I couldn't hear that.
I was saying, Ed, one needs to roll up this data and make it understandable and presentable. So do we have the resources to do that?
The analysis of the data and chopping that is really not it's going to be a large data set, but yeah, it's not a lot of work compared to actually generating it But also to Bill's point is we have to be able to, what is the end game here? If it's just
Yeah.
a reporting thing that says our EEU is this, that's not really doing much. If we do have targets and we hold individual buildings against targets, or, then it's a different story. I tend to think we should have
Okay.
some
Okay.
reason to be doing this. Versus, I know there's some advocates in town who have felt the building baselines and the BIDU was a very, very strong requirement, but it sort of didn't get too far past that. And again, personal cut is, if we're going to require them to do this, we should be doing something positive with the data. And I also agree with Bill's point that unless we're really looking at, the emissions and what they're actually doing with the energy, then it may not be such a strong exercise.
Well, I would say that I think that we could look at the energy use and what it's being used for in the building. And if there's, for instance, if they're shifting over from, say, gas boilers to electric, heating systems, we could somehow figure that into the analysis. But where the energy is coming from, I think, is may be a consideration, but until all of our energy is coming from 100% renewable, statewide, countrywide, or whatever, it's a zero-sum game. There's not enough renewable energy to go around. And so just saying that I'm going to use all renewable energy for my building, that means somebody else isn't going to be able to use that renewable energy. So it is important that all buildings reduce their energy usage, regardless of whether they're sourcing that from a carbon-free source or not. It's still important that all buildings reduce their energy usage.
I don't find that compelling.
Well, until all the energy sources that are available to us are renewable, I'd like to see how you don't find that compelling.
I want to incentivize people to reduce their emissions. If you combine the energy use with the source selection, then I see a goal. I see a thing I would do with it, which is get on the case of people who, when you multiply their use amounts times their source, which I think you were suggesting, but is not in the language of what this ordinance would be about, then I understand it. But at the margin, asking somebody to drive down their energy use, period, if, for example, they are going to, what we as homeowners can do, you can pay the supplement to incentivize the construction or the sourcing of more renewable energy in your residential bill. That's a good thing to do. I don't want to be dinged for how much energy I use if I've already put my incentives into the system to shift and support more renewable energy generation. So I think maybe this is a time span issue. You're right instantaneously, but in the long run, generating the demand for low emission energy is what I want to do. And I'm not going to generate that demand, that is the construction of more renewables, if I'm tanking the demand for energy per se.
Pat, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, can I go back to something that I thought Susan was saying? It's a little off this point, which is that even if Ed says this is an easy job to deal with all this data, I don't think it's going to be that easy. And we are right now dealing with a part-time energy manager, and we need a full-time energy manager who probably has a little bit of staff. So when you're asking about financial tools and resources, I don't think we can do all this with Ed just working harder.
I agree 100% that, I think the long-term vision is a sustainability department, staffed with other people, or additional people, I should say. Now, it didn't say it was going to be easy. It just said it was easier than the actual putting together the reporting. But, and I think I go back to Bill's point too. I'm not, honestly, not getting the end game with this ordinance as it's suggested.
I think the end game is the same as Boston's, which is to have targets to shoot for buildings to reduce their energy usage.
I understand that. I think I'm more in Bill's camp of, I don't want to say Bill's camp, but of reducing emissions. We're almost looking at a mini greenhouse gas analysis for each of these buildings and seeing what they're doing with it. A switch from oil boilers over to electric heat pumps is huge in the emission standards. It's a huge change and a huge positive change, but then their electricity energy usage goes way up.
Which gets to the making sure that we're understanding the sources.
Well, we can include it in the BUDO, right? In the analysis, is it can include what the source of the electricity, what the source of the energy is, right?
Absolutely.
But do we require them to report it?
Again, I think that's why we look at what other best practices are being used by other cities and see what they're doing. And quite frankly, we're almost out of time, and I think, we need to move on to the next item from what I saw from the note that we received.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for prompting the. Sorry, I have to move things down. Trying to look at here with fewer screens. Okay, so hopefully now we get into more depth on something that is maybe a little more action oriented, and it's to the results that maybe we want to see more of. So getting to a net zero resource efficient building standard, ultimately I think adopting whatever the state comes out with as soon as possible, but there's certainly things that maybe we want to go ahead and do within Watertown to get ahead of that, being that an uncertain process at the state level. So I think this is probably the same champions as we've identified before. So maybe just since we are a little bit behind, maybe we can jump right into the implementation steps, and we can go back and fill that part out later. But maybe I'll also stop and just make sure that we're good on the intent of the action and what it is that we're trying to achieve with it. Okay, questions? Don't see any hands raised. Implementation steps. What's it going to take? Where do we begin?
Well, at the end of 2022, if we're allowed to pass an ordinance, or is it a building code? Is it a new building code? I think it is. Then the town, probably the town council has to look at that.
Yeah, my understanding is it would be with the Massachusetts building code that towns would have the option to, include a net zero
Stretch code, yeah.
yeah, within the stretch code. So I think you're absolutely right, Pat, that this does have to be enacted by the state, comes out, and then the town has to take actions to adopt that. And ultimately that would be through the town council, although I expect it would follow the same process I described earlier, going through community development and planning, presented to the planning board. The planning board would have a couple of meetings on it with public outreach. And then should they decide to recommend it to the town council, it would go to the town council. And there'd be a couple of public meetings there for input. And then town council would ultimately, hopefully adopt it.
Okay.
Question, Mike, and maybe Ed, I don't know. I thought I'd heard Kim at some point say that we needed to do, we weren't really able to wait for the state for action on this. And I wasn't quite sure if I remember that correctly. And if I did, what she meant by that. Do you know what I'm talking about, Mike? Did you hear that statement? Do you know what I mean, have you had discussions within KLA about that? That the waiting for the action from the state is we need to do something before that as an interim action? Or am I just imagining that?
That is, yes, the idea is that are there things related to this that we can get ahead of the state's process? You know, I think there are potentially parts of what would ultimately become something that you could enact or following the stretch code process when that becomes available that you could start getting ahead on, like thinking about what are the levels of embodied carbon maybe that you want to have as part of the maybe compliance mechanisms there, or you know, thinking about where this integrates with some of the other actions of the plans, like continuing to advance and strengthen Watertown electricity choice. Is that something that becomes a way that buildings can feed into as an alternative compliance mechanism and make those achievements of that program go further faster than maybe would be otherwise possible with people just buying into it.
So would it make sense to put some of those steps in there as sort of interim steps during in the implementation steps towards the goal towards doing the full-blown net zero zoning?
Yes, I believe so. So maybe that begins with thinking about embodied carbon and where can that be worked in through maybe what building owners have to submit at this point, and you know, getting them ready for that process of having to incorporate these things later on. Marcus, maybe you haven't chimed in much on this, and maybe if you have some thoughts on where, from the building developer perspective, you could see the pathway to sort of ramping up to being able to implement this with full steam when it's allowable.
I mean, I think it's critical that to sort of determine what data we're actually looking to aggregate. I mean, it's simple enough. It's simple enough to sort of take the data that we're using off of main electrical panels, water meters, that, you know, water coming into a building, and also sort of and also our natural gas usage. But if we're looking to track the you know, how much of that energy that was how much of that energy demand of a building is allocated towards heat pumps, that's a difficult thing to track, and I think is going to be a major financial burden to an owner, especially if it's something that needs to be retrofitted after the fact. It's kind of one of my major thoughts is sort of I think that's one of the integral components of defining the data that we're looking to aggregate.
Yep. So, you know, I think in that sense, it's just considering the building systems that exist today and how those would combine to ultimately comply.
I think the other thing too is if you're looking to get a little bit more granular data, I think it'd be important to figure out how to normalize that as well, so that once it's submitted, it's not a massive task to try to filter it out and clean it up. And I think that kind of goes back towards the equity question that we had talked about and the burden on the town. So I think that's one of the the important things is trying to define sort of how that data is going to be aggregated and submitted or compiled, I should say.
Right.
Mike, you have the benefit of me being in this room. I'm about to close the rooms.
No.
You need
Yeah.
another minute?
Well, no, I think if we're at time, we're at time.
Okay. This will give us a minute buffer once I close them, okay?
Okay. Ed, you talked about that, you know, really from the committees and going through planning board and ultimately to council as implementation steps. So that's, you know, something that we can work back from the previous action and incorporate that. Thanks definitely everyone for food for thought. I think Bill, particularly your thoughts and Ed's, and just making sure that we're maybe going back and making sure that the intent of the actions are well targeted, I think is going to be a good process for doing this. And of course, we'll be looking to continue to fill these things out in various committee work. So yeah, appreciate people participating here. Sometimes it's challenging to fit the conversations, I think, into the frameworks that we have, but we'll continue to work on them. Any closing thoughts before Danielle shuts us down?
Just thanks for moderating this, Mike.
Yeah,
Thanks, Brian.
yeah.
That's it.
Not an easy path.
Well, let's have the sausage name.
All right. I think we probably interrupted the buildings group in a good conversation here. Well, welcome back. I hope everybody had productive conversations, that you got to talk through some implementation details. And we'll just present a couple of last items here and next steps, and then get you out of here on time as promised. So I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. Okay. Can I get some nods or thumbs up that you can see my screen?
Yes.
So many, great. Oh, that is, we're going through the whole slide deck again. Okay. So here is our project timeline again. It is October somehow, and we are at our third meeting. And in the next couple of months, the consultant team and the staff will be working hard to build out a draft climate and energy plan. And as we mentioned before, there's going to be an opportunity to have a public dialogue as well, potentially in December. So stay tuned for that. And then we will be refining that plan and making it available for public comment in, I believe, late February into March. So we'll keep you posted on that exact time frame, but you'll have a chance to weigh in on the actual draft document as well. And then from there, from about April onward, it's in the hands of you all and the town to be really implementing and then revisiting this plan every 5 years. So great. Our next steps are going to be to convene in working groups if you'd like to build out additional blueprints. We'll be working on building out the 2 that we discussed today, but you are welcome to, now that you've gone through the process and you know how to do it, you're welcome to continue doing that for other actions. So we encourage you to meet in your groups and get in touch with Laurel if you need any support with that. Please be an ambassador for this planning process in your networks. That's the most effective way to spread the word. And we hope that you will fill out our second survey and tell folks about it as well. And then we would love, love, love if you could share some high quality, high resolution photos with us so that we can put them in the plan of sustainable things that you come across in Watertown or that you're doing in your life. That would be really, really great. So you can send those to Laurel.
Yep,
I believe.
fine.
Yep, that works.
Yep.
I think that general resilient Watertown email works as well, and I can pull that up on the screen for folks. But we just encourage you to keep visiting our website, resilient.watertown-ma.gov, for additional updates. And thank you all. Thank you all so much for your participation. I think we're ending a tad early here, which is great. Kim, I don't know if you have any final thoughts, or Steve or Laurel.
So thank you. I'll let Steve and Laurel do it, but we had a great discussion in the public health group, lots of exciting actions moving forward. So, you know, really, again, thank you all for the hard work. And this is a lot of work. You know, we're trying to transform our community and prepare for climate change. It's not easy. So really value the time and input that you're all providing.
Yeah, I'll just second that, Kim. Thanks. You know, I think it is very important work and appreciate everyone's efforts. And I'm sure Laurel won't say it for herself. Or for that matter, Talia, both of them have put in an awful lot of work on this and have done a tremendous job of, you know, coordinating our efforts and bringing this project as far as we've gotten today, in addition to all of you. So thank you, and we'll look forward to the next steps.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. We really, really, really appreciate all of your hard work and passion about this process.
Thanks very much. All right. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Happy Halloween.
I realized if anybody's still on the live stream, I'll pull up that email again. Here's that email address, resilient@watertown-ma.gov. I'll put it in the chat as well, and then we will sign off. Okay, thanks, folks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.